The night rain fell like tears on broken glass, each drop slicing through the silence like regret. In an alley painted with shadows, he knelt, the wolf, the man who made kings tremble and enemies vanish. His white shirt was no longer white, it was red, soaked through with the life he couldn't save. His hands trembled, not from pain, not from fear, but from something far heavier. Guilt. In his palm lay the bullet, still warm, glistening with blood that wasn't his. Her blood. The same woman who once told him that monsters don't cry, and yet tonight, he was proving her wrong. They called him the wolf because he hunted without mercy, ruled without conscience, and loved no one. Power was his religion, loyalty, his commandment. But she, Elena, had been different. She didn't fear him. She saw through the armor, through the violence, straight into the hollow man hiding beneath the legend. He tried to push her away, to drown her light with his darkness. But light is stubborn. And love, even in the heart of a monster, has a way of finding its way through the cracks. Now she lay motionless beside him, her breathing shallow, her skin pale against the dark rain. Every second felt like an eternity closing in. He pressed his hand over her wound, whispering her name as if it were a prayer that could rewrite fate. He had faced death 100 times, laughed in its face, but this was different. Death had never taken something he couldn't replace. Until now. He looked at the bullet again. The irony clawed at him, it was meant for him. His enemies had aimed to break his body, but instead, they shattered his soul. And as he stared at the blood pooling beneath her, he realized something that terrified him more than the sound of gunfire ever could. He'd trade his empire, his vengeance, even his name, just to hear her laugh again. For years, the city feared his silence, the calm before the storm that destroyed everything in its path. But tonight, his silence was different. It wasn't the silence of power. It was the silence of loss. The silence of a man who'd finally found something worth living for, only to watch it slip away between his fingers. He had always said real men don't cry. But as the rain mixed with the tears he didn't want to admit were his, the wolf broke his own rule. Because for the first time, the man who feared nothing had something to lose, and the man who never cried, couldn't stop. The question now was no longer about survival, or revenge, or power. It was something deeper, rawer. How does a man who has taken so much from the world ever forgive himself for losing the one soul who gave him back his humanity? And as the storm raged around him, his whisper carried through the dark, "Don't leave me." They tell stories about him the way people tell warnings, softly, with a glance over the shoulder, as if the sound of his name could still unsettle the air. I have watched that name grow from a bruise into a brand, from a boy with 2 sharp elbows to a man who bent a whole city to his will. He learned early that the world owed him nothing, what it paid was merciless and immediate. The streets raised him with fist and favor, taught him that loyalty was currency and fear its exchange rate. By the time he was 25 he had the calm of a man who'd seen enough blood to pattern his life around it. He walked like a verdict. He spoke like a sentence. They called him the wolf because wolves move at night and take what they need without apology. They called him that because when he decided something, the city rearranged itself to respect the decision. Power became his habit, precision his devotion. Emotions were a flaw you could not afford in the ledger of survival, and he learned to file them away in a locked room behind his jaw. There was a cold geometry to his days, meticulous meetings, ledgers balanced with the same steady hand that could sign away a life, and his mansion reflected that inner architecture, glass and marble and angles that cut the light into silent accusations. Under the chandeliers the servants kept their distance, even the portraits seemed to watch with a clinical, assessing eye. Inside, everything gleamed, everything obeyed. Then she walked in like a mistake. Elena was not the sort of woman who belonged in his neighborhood, much less in his orbit. She carried no interest in the ledger, no taste for the ritual of submission the city demanded. A doctor in a world that preferred its wounds to fester, she healed where everyone else ignored. When she first treated one of his men, an ankle wound stitched with more courage than caution. She did it with hands that were both practiced and kind in a way that made the men who saw her blush like children. She moved through his world as if it were a foreign country she'd chosen to visit out of curiosity rather than need. Her laugh was a misfit sound, a bright thing in the dimness of his empire, and it offended him and intrigued him both. For years he had been defended by silence and obedience. Here was a woman who violated both conventions by existing in the same space without yielding. That was the beginning of the small dissolutions that no ledger could track. It was a look across a courtyard that lasted too long. It was a hand lingered in conversation while his men watched, uncertain as pups. It was an argument about whether a man deserved treatment if he'd earned his wounds honestly, and a sharp look from Elena that reduced his doctrine to dust. She did not flatter him, she refused his gifts on principle. She judged him the way a surgeon judges the rot beneath the skin, cool, unpitying, but necessary. And because she refused to be seduced by the myth of him, because she trespassed into his rigid world carrying the tiny, dangerous thing called humanity, he found himself watching moments he had never allowed himself to collect, the way she tied her hair back when she was tired, the way her fingers trembled sometimes after a long night of saving others, the way she looked at his men with something that could be called hope if hope were not illegal in his circles. The city around them was a beast coiled to strike, neon flickering over pavement that swallowed more than light. Alleyways stitched the neighborhoods into a web whose threads were rumors and grudges. Every corner whispered of betrayal in a dozen dead languages, and even the rain smelled faintly of iron and compromise. There were nights when the sirens sang like hymns, and other nights when silence was the loudest, a vacuum that made conspiracies amplify until they became truth. He had learned to navigate this city with maps burned into his memory, where a toothless informant might sit, which bartender could be bribed with silence, which police officer had a price higher than God. He shaped his rule around the city's hunger and fed it just enough to keep the animal tame. The men under him prospered in measured increments, their obedience not affection but an economy of survival. Elena, when she moved among them, did not see their value as assets. She saw, in the places they were hollowed out by need, the parts that could be healed. That made her dangerous, because healing undid the work of a lifetime, it made men human again. The inciting night arrived like every bad decision does, sudden, inevitable, and stupid in hindsight. He understood the rhythms of threat the way a surgeon understands a pulse, but even surgeons are sometimes surprised by the speed of an aneurysm. They had been warned, as they always were, whispers, a courier with eyes too wide, a drunk who knew too much and said too little. He believed the world could be bent back into place with a few precise actions, one strike, one message, and the equation would balance. He arrived at the rendezvous prepared in the calm that had served him his whole life. The alley should have been another scene in his ledger, another suppressed entry. He had rehearsed the contingency in the privacy of his mind. He had never rehearsed for the thing that finally broke the shape of his life, her stepping between him and the shot. There is a kind of slow-motion cruelty to the moment when a perfect plan unravels. The sound of the gun was not the loudest thing, the loudness came afterward, in a syllable of horror that lived inside his chest. He saw the arc of the moment as if he were watching someone else's film, her body moving, the angle of her head, the way the light caught the bullet. He felt the impact not in his body but as an earthquake in the architecture of who he had been. He had never been close to bleeding for someone who was not his kin. He had never known what it meant to plead under a ceiling that had no roof in his kingdom. He carried her through the rain with a desperation that surprised even him, screams tearing from a throat that had been trained to command, not beg. In those minutes, the wolf's composure cracked into betrayals of sound. He pounded on car hoods, he cursed at gods he had never before acknowledged, he demanded help from people who owed him favors not in currency but in fear. He had always thought the worst thing that could happen to him was loss of control, now he knew worse. Control had never meant anything if it couldn't bend fate back around the ones you loved. The inciting incident wasn't only the bullet, it was the realization that his life, built like a fortress, had no keep for what mattered most. As rain and blood mixed on his sleeve, he understood that the ledger could not account for the cost of a human heart. And for the first time since he had become a legend, he did not know what to do next. They told themselves the city would bend back into order because that is what cities do. They swallow chaos until it becomes an anecdote and then they move on. He had believed that for so long he could have taught it as doctrine. Orders were given, debts collected, challengers taught to fear the precision of his retaliation. But the night Elena bled on his hands, the ledger that had always kept him honest began to smear. The doctor's voice in the sterile hospital corridor was thin, a thread stretched between two truths, one the clinical certainty of trauma and the other the impossible hope he could not afford to nurture. "She might not survive the night," she said, and the words landed like a verdict that had nothing to do with law. For the first time in years, prognosis outranked policy. The empire, always an abstract mathematical certainty, turned into something fragile and immediate, and it frightened him in a way that no rival ever had. News travels fast in his city, fear travels faster. His men felt it in the twitch of their hands and the jitter of radios. The rivals smelled it as a change in the air, a scent like blood that invites wolves to a carcass. Within hours the lines that once held firm like a net began to fray. Men who had been content to survive under his shadow started to test the edges. A lieutenant who had been careful since childhood misread silence as surrender and struck a small, reckless blow, nothing the world would write about, but enough to set a precedent. The docks, which had been quiet for weeks, now hosted shadows that moved with confidence. Messages were intercepted and returned like taunts. The city's ecosystem, which had adapted to his balance of fear and favor, recalibrated toward chaos because the thing that had held one of its strongest anchors in place seemed to be shaking. Inside his mansion the problem took on a different face. Men who once quoted his edicts without question now whispered into sleeves, eyes darting for a sign. The wolf's stewardship had never relied entirely on kindness. His was a kingdom built from calculation, loyalties purchased in blood and promises, favors that came due like interest. But what do you do when the currency you rely on becomes meaningless in the face of the human? His closest confidants, those who had grown up with him or had been bought early and kept loyally, began to fracture under a pressure they hadn't anticipated. They wanted blood. They wanted the sort of revenge that confirmed power, the kind of swift and brutal response that reasserted control. They wanted to paint the city's walls with consequences so loud the rumor mill would stop guessing. "Let me burn them," a captain whispered. "Send men. Make this hurt them where it counts." He heard them. He felt the old music of decision rise in his chest as if a conductor had taken up a baton. The instinctual response was crystallized in muscle memory: find the shooter, find the line that led to the head of the snake, sever it cleanly, and let the rest rearrange themselves in the wake. Vengeance was a language he spoke fluently. It had been the grammar of his life. But the image of Elena, pale, fragile, tubes threading into her like arteries into an already frayed world, had smoothed his reflexes into something unrecognizable. For the first time, his calculations had to account for holding a hand rather than delivering a blow. The ledger offered no formula for a lover's survival. The world he had built had no clause for mercy. And yet mercy, of all things, felt necessary. He began gathering information as if he might save her by outthinking the city. The wolf's men dug and fetched and returned with names and obscured faces. He sat in rooms where men prostrated themselves with offers of loyalty and strategy. He smiled the old smiles and played at the old role because necessity required camouflage. But while he orchestrated strikes and built nets, his heart kept returning to the bed where Elena lay. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and the kind of exhaustion that massages the bones of saints and sinners alike. There, in a dim room lit by machines and hope, he became the man no one had ever truly seen. In public he remained a strategist, by her side he became a supplicant. Then he found the line that led to the man who'd ordered the hit. The name reached him like a compass bearing, a fixer with a loyalty on the market, a politician who traded votes like commodities, a face he'd seen at a table once and dismissed as an inconvenience. The man's reasons were a tangled skein: money, ego, the kind of old grudge that has the taste of rust. The wolf's world had always provided a solution for such things: remove the variable, punish the instigator, send a message that would echo across alleys and offices. To kill him would not only quash the immediate threat, it would restore the calculus of fear that underpinned his rule. The optics were clear. The mechanics, too. It would be a surgical strike that every man who owed allegiance would watch with the kind of satisfaction that repairs insecurity. But the hospital bed pulled on him like a magnet. The choice became a geometry between two fixed points: avenge or attend. Do you save the life of the person you love by leaving her at the place where people die alone and go claim your power? Or do you stay and let the consequences of inaction ripple outward, past your men and into the city you have kept in careful suspension for years? He who had once decided on the elimination of rivals with dispassionate cruelty now hesitated because his heart had been given something to lose. The men around him grew impatient. If you don't act, they said, they will. And then there will be no coming back. They urged him to be the kind of leader the city expected: decisive, ruthless, efficient. They invoked legacy as if his empire was a script that could not be rewritten. The moral crossroads sat on his chest every night. He replayed scenarios until his mind was a landscape littered with the corpses of possible futures. If he killed the man who ordered the hit, the message would be loud and permanent. The city would hush, grudgingly respectful once again. But Elena, alive or dead, would find a ruler returned to the throne, possibly more monstrous for it. Would she accept a man who had made the calculus that her life required collateral for power? If he stayed, committed to being at her side through the long drag of recovery or the hollow of mourning, his influence would shrink. Men would test edges. Rivals might cascade into open war. He could lose everything he had built: wealth, control, the very fear that made his world stable. But what would be the point of all of it if it bought him a kingdom when the woman who made him human lay dying? It was not a simple question of heart versus head. It was a reshaping of identity. He had to reconcile the man who signed orders with the man who held a fragile hand in the night. He had to consider whether the boy who grew up learning that kindness was a weakness could be taught something else in time to save what mattered. And worse, he had to ask if the cost of returning to his old ways, of avenging properly, would be a soul she would no longer recognize. There is a cruelty in revenge: it is absolute and leaves no room for tenderness. It also promises order, and order was the only language he had spoken fluently for decades. So he sat. He sat beside the bed as the city churned and his men made plans. The beeping monitors provided a rhythm to his new kind of waiting, a mechanical metronome that marked time in small, merciless increments. He watched every breath she drew as if counting could summon life. He whispered into the dark without expecting the reply: apologies for the lives he had taken, promises he did not deserve, prayers he had never been taught. In confession, he offered up things he had once considered liabilities: softness, fear, love. He admitted to himself in quiet that the ledger had never accounted for loss measured in eyelashes or the way a hand fit into another. He vowed, beneath the hum of fluorescent light, that he would exchange all his empires for the sound of her laugh. His men came to him with the roughness of men who had never learned another language. They wanted names, bodies, the satisfaction of thunder. He granted them gestures, plans on paper, flares of intention that placated for nights but demanded something harsher come dawn. He made his calls, sent his threats, orchestrated diversions. He ordered moves that would protect their holdings and buy him breathing room, but he held back the final blade. He could kill the man who'd pulled the trigger and then return to hold Elena as she woke, to console and threaten and dominate with a tenderness that would horrify his old self. Or he could stay at her bedside and let the city bleed into anarchy, letting rivals carve a new order while he learned the price of being small. The choice was not framed in words like a courtroom, it lived in the marrow of his bones. There were nights when he leaned over her and thought of all the faces his choices had left behind: children orphaned by his edicts, allies who had trusted his iron, enemies who had survived to plot. He imagined the man who'd ordered the hit pleading for his life as the wolf's boot hovered, imagined the thin satisfaction of restitution. He imagined Elena's face afterwards, what forgiveness might look like, or the opposite, the coldness of someone who recognized a monster who'd returned to the same hunger. He imagined the city restored, but him unrecognizable to the woman he loved. And so he stayed. He chose to remain in the sterile light, to measure his days in the shallow breaths of a woman who had stolen his armor with a scalpel of laughter. He made arrangements, safe houses bolstered, lines of defense repositioned, trusted lieutenants given instructions to act without his signal, because he could not believe that absence would not be used as an opportunity. He did not order the final strike. He left the killing to the inevitability of men who could not live with hesitation. It was a choice that would cost him, the kind of choice that shapes the future either into ruin or revelation. As dawn slid into the hospital through Venetian blinds, he realized the stakes had moved beyond territory or reputation. He was learning, painfully, that the ledger of a life could be rewritten when the cost became human. He could not predict whether his mercy would make him weak or make him whole. He only knew that for now he could not bear the thought of being the man who had taught Elena the hardness of his world one more time. So he sat, whispered, and watched the monitors like someone studying a map of a place he had to navigate blind. The city would adjust. It always did. But he had a new map now, drawn in the contours of a woman's ribs and the fragile rhythm of breath. I had thought I knew the shape of loyalty in that city. I had watched men swear oaths with mouths that bled lies and fists that signed contracts in blood, and I had learned to read the quiet places where allegiance hid. Still, nothing prepared me for the way betrayal arrived, soft, domestic, wearing the familiar face of a brother. For weeks after the bullet, the wolf moved in a fog of plans and prayers, holding Elena's weight in his arms like a secret he could not share. He paced the old maps of the city as if retracing steps might lead him backward to the moment it all began. Men brought him names, rehearsed confessions, and false leads spun so quickly that you could see the lie in the thread. He took them the way a man takes medicine, because some salve is better than none, and kept his head bowed to the bedside where the woman whose laugh had stolen his nights lay half alive and wholly present to his shame. The first time the evidence came it arrived as an irritation. A courier returned with his own seal, the edges of the paper damp with rain, the ink smeared where a hand had trembled. He had sent out probes, little things, measurements of response, and the replies were not what one would expect when you push on the underbelly of a city's underworld. The map of culpability folded inward, and the lines started to converge on a man who had once been indistinguishable from his own shadow. Matteo had been in his orbit since the beginning, when both were boys and the world offered them only scraps to eat. Matteo had the kind of smile that could be used to negotiate peace in a war and the kind of hands that were steady in the doing of ugly things. He had sat at the wolf's right hand through coups and car fires and funerals where the mourners were paid more than they grieved. He had married the wolf's enemies into alliances and had once saved the boss's life with a coolness that looked more like calculation than courage. Men like Matteo were rare because they were loyal by design, selected, then cultivated, rewarded with small kindnesses that bound them close. To suspect him required courage or an appetite for ruin. But evidence is a patient animal. It sleeps in corners and gnaws at secrets until they unravel. When investigators, men who had once bled for the wolf and now bled for the ledger, cross-checked phone pings, watched nights that had been recorded by imperfect cameras, and traced the circulation of funds, what should have been a continent of confusion narrowed to a single river. A transfer here, a whispered meeting there, a DNA sample on a cigar but found near a sniper's perch, a pattern emerged. The pattern had the strange intimacy of a handwritten confession. Matteo's fingerprints were not on the gun, but they were on the threads tied to it. He had met with the fixer 3 nights earlier. He had been the one to reroute a courier. He had been the one to open a window that was supposed to be shut. He had not staged the ambush alone, but he had provided the architecture for it to fall in the exact manner it did. Men returned with pieces of truth like puzzle fragments, the bolt cut from a door, the empty bottle from a bar where Matteo had laughed too long, the receipt for a glove bought in a neighborhood where Matteo owned a front. The pieces, when laid on the table between the wolf's clenched hands, completed an image no one wanted to look at. When he learned, he did not roar. The wolf's voice, when it came, was a low instrument played at a slow tempo, each word measured like a wound. He walked into rooms as if the world had been rearranged by a hand that loved irony. The man he trusted best had not only betrayed the code, he had done it with a hand so intimate it felt obscene. The betrayal was not a clean stroke, it was a smear. Matteo had folded his resentment into an act so personal that the bloodied consequence landed squarely against the wolf's chest. It was one thing to lose a territory, another to lose a brother. The discovery made the wolf return to the nights of their shared past, the handful of memories that men like them obsessed over in the lonely hours between deals, the boyhood scrap where Matteo had taken a knife for him and kept it, the time Matteo had hidden a wounded man in a cellar while the wolf negotiated a peace that bought them both time, the promises whispered between them that were more sacred than scripture because they were the only vows the streets would trust. It was a long list of small mercies that formed a scaffolding of trust. And then, threaded through those memories like a cold stitch, was the revelation that Matteo had been carrying a tenderness for Elena that the wolf had never noticed until it was too late. Matteo's love, it seemed, had been the sort that does not honor boundaries. It looks like protection until it looks like ownership. The evidence suggested jealousy that had been fed by the kind of silence that breeds monsters, moments where Matteo had watched Elena and not spoken, where his hands clenched and unclenched, where he had retreated into a corner of his heart and schemed in the dark. When confronted, Matteo did not deny things in a way that suggested guilt or innocence, he explained. It is remarkable how often traitors are the first to translate their acts into language that can sound almost reasonable. He said his love had been quiet for years, an ember watched from a distance, and when he saw her step nearer to the wolf, he believed opportunity had ousted patience. He told stories about small slights, about the nights he had stood awake because the wolf's presence made him unable to sleep, about the times he had been dismissed or overlooked because history seemed to favor one man in every room, and about a fixation that metastasized into a plan. He painted the scene for the wolf as if he were not a villain but a man who finally chose action where before there had only been yearning. There were moments when his voice cracked with something that might have been sorrow. There were moments when he said he never meant for Elena to die, that she was a contingency he had not counted on, and the thing that made those words dangerous was the wolf's knowledge of all the times Matteo had risked death in the boss's name and been rewarded with a silence that had nothing to do with gratitude. The revelation lodged in the wolf's chest like a second bullet. There is a peculiar cruelty to learning that the instrument of your own potential undoing was fashioned by a man who had once stood beside you in the trenches. He moved through the revelation with the same clinical attention he had once given to the tally of territories, inventory of grievances, catalogue of slights, measure of motives. He replayed conversations in which Matteo had been present, re-examined decisions that had favored one outcome over another, and felt old kindnesses mutate under new light. A letter found in a burned-out safe, one written by Matteo in a moment of drunken clarity, spoke not only of anger but of admiration warped into something owner-like. It listed petty things, the way Elena folded napkins, the fact that she once looked at Matteo with gratitude the way one looks at someone who has returned a lost thing. The letter read like an archive of small infidelities of the soul, each line adding weight to the conclusion that what had started as emotion had curdled into a plot. What complicated the thing, what made it slippery and too human to be slain with a blade, was Matteo himself when faced with the wolf's confrontation. Men who betray are often cowards until they stand exposed. Matteo was bare and unmannered but not weak. He did not beg for life in the way low men do, instead he offered the wolf a bare, brutal truth, that he had always wanted what the wolf had, love, recognition, the right to be seen, and in not being the wolf he had learned to be a ghost who loved from the margins. He had set the trap not merely to remove a rival but to break the man he could not be. If I could not have her because she chose you, Matteo said, then I would choose to make you know what my life was like. The words had the weight of confession and the chill of calculation. He had wanted to wound the wolf where it would hurt the most, the heart that had finally found something worth protecting. The wolf listened in silence that did not soften him, it clarified him. He felt the old hunger for retribution raise its head like a tide, obedient to the moon of his history. The men around him, when told, wanted blood at once. They wanted the satisfying geometry of justice, an eye for an eye, the city's scales balanced with a splash of red. It would have been simple, effective, and final. A killing would have been a lesson. It would have closed the wound by scorched earth. The optics would have been pristine, a king reasserting rule, a tyrant restoring fear. But the wolf was no longer convinced that restoration through violence would quiet anything. If he killed Matteo, he thought, the sound of the shot would, yes, make the city hush for a night, but the hollowness at his center, the fissure opened by seeing the person he had called brother become his betrayer, would remain. A corpse would not teach him how to keep the laughter he valued safe. A corpse would only create a new ledger of grievance and copycat cruelty. He also felt a strange tenderness that surprised him. In the raw calculus of souls, Matteo was still the man who had once given him a knife and a promise. Watching the traitor speak about Elena's smile, the wolf could almost imagine a different world where Matteo's love had been tended rather than twisted. That imagining made the choice unbearable. To slay Matteo would be to deny the life they had shared, to cut out a chapter of himself that had been freshly written in pain. To forgive Matteo would be to abandon the notion of immediate retribution and to embrace a cost he was not sure he could pay, public perception of weakness, a creaking of his authority at a moment when stability mattered most. Then a new evidence surfaced. An old friend who had been paid to watch Matteo confessed that the lieutenant had not acted alone in the practical logistics. He had recruited a small ring of conspirators who wanted the wolf replaced or broken. The ring's motives varied: money, land, a petty grudge here and there, but the central thread was Matteo's jealousy. He had orchestrated the plan and let it bloom, men eager for a power shift filled in the details. The revelation that Matteo had used others made the betrayal more monstrous and less solitary. It also made retribution more politically complicated. Killing Matteo might not end the aspirations of those who had used him, it might fuel them. The wolf's mind moved to the geometry of consequences. If he killed Matteo, what would happen to the ring? Would they dissolve in fear? Would they rise like an infection? If he spared Matteo, would his inner circle see him as compromised? Would Elena, if she lived, ever be able to see the man who forgave as worthy of the tenderness she had once offered him? The questions spun around the wolf like vultures, patient and waiting. He spent long nights with Matteo in a room cut off from the city's noise, a place where the two men who had been boys together now measured silence and regret. Matteo did not offer platitudes. He offered facts and apologies and a confession that his love had been a disease that consumed his reason. He spoke of nights when he had watched Elena do her work and wondered why the wolf was so favored by fate, and of how watching favored him nothing except a hollow ache. He admitted to miscalculations, to the reality that he had not intended her death but had failed to plan for her survival. He asked, not for absolution, but for some answer to the question of whether a man who had loved wrongly could be forgiven. The wolf realized in those long hours that he stood at a moral vertex where the path split into an irreversible binary: avenge and maintain the language of power that had always defined him, or forgive and risk the world he had built in the name of something he had only recently learned to call love. The choice would not be simple theater. It would be the kind of decision that defines the architecture of a life. A killing would restore his public stability, a mercy would alter his private map. Both outcomes had casualties. If he killed Matteo, he shattered the last trace of brotherhood. If he forgave him, he shattered the myth of ruthless governance that had kept the city in a certain order. The wolf did not sleep for nights. He walked the city's borders in the dark, he visited the docks, he listened to the mutters of men who would be watching his next move like weather. He thought of Elena's face, of how she had looked at him when she'd first refused his money, of how her hands had hovered over wounds and made a practice of gentleness. He thought about whether she would want him to kill, to rip vengeance from his chest and make it clean. He imagined her in recovery, waking to a wolf who had returned to being the wolf, or to a man who had been reduced by mercy. The moral question was no longer abstract. It had a name and a shape and was pressing against his ribs. At the end of the hour the wolf's decision had not yet hardened into law. The revelation had cut him open, exposed chambers he had kept locked, and now those rooms were full of choices. He had learned that betrayal can be the most intimate violence because it comes from a hand that once warmed your shoulder. He had also learned that love can twist a man's sense of right until he mistakes possession for devotion. And now the question, the new emotional question, sat like an ember ready to scorch. What does a man do when the person who betrayed him once called him brother? Does he avenge her by killing the man who loved her wrongly, or does he honor her by finding a mercy that might save more than just one life? The answer, he discovered, would not come from the bottom of a glass nor the barrel of a gun. It would come from a place he had avoided his entire life, the quieter, more dangerous measure of what kind of man he wanted to be when the ledger was closed. They say dawn at the docks smells like salt and old money, like engines and rusted promises. I know that smell now as well as I know the creak of the wolf's boots on marble, because I have watched him move through both worlds, the immaculate corridors of his mansion and the wet, yawning docks where men make bargains with the tide. He came to the water when the sky was a bruise and the city still slept in the hollow between one bad night and the next. The fog lay low, a gray blanket that swallowed light and muffled sound. Gulls argued over something the sea had spit up and a lone lamppost flickered like an unsteady watchman. He moved with the economy of a man who had made a life out of being efficient, one step at a time, breathing measured, hands in pockets until the confrontation demanded otherwise. His men had brought him lead on a platter, delivered coordinates like prayers. The traitor who had once called himself brother had a rendezvous at the old pier, an iron skeleton where ships came to die and secrets went to drown. He found him in the place where things are forgotten, leaning against a rail that had been polished to a dull sheen by years of weather and cigarette ash, shoulders bent like a man under an unwritten confession. Mateo's face had the colors of someone who'd been up too many nights and had been teaching himself how to be two people at once, a soldier in daylight and a conspirator in shadow. When he saw the wolf he did not stand as if surprised, he had expected this meeting. There are betrayals that end with surprise and there are betrayals that end with ritual. This was ritual, two men who had once shared bread, now meeting under the sky to resolve what the ledger had left undone. The air was thin and a cold came in from the water that cut the breath into sharp syllables. The wolf's hand found the weight at his hip with the old ease, an act performed so frequently in other lives that it had become reflex. He held the gun steady and yet his hand shook, not with fear of death but with the tremor of something deeper, the aftershock of watching human life fracture at the seams. When a man has killed before, the hand can be steady. When he has hesitated in front of a bed where the woman he loves is barely tethered to breath, nerves betray themselves. Mateo watched him measure the distance and at once the history between them filled the space like an argument. He spoke first, because men who betray often cannot carry the silence of their guilt. You look like you could use a reason, Hermano, he said, voice rough like a rope. You want a reason, take mine. There were no fireworks at first, just the flat, dull clink of a cigarette as Mateo lit it and the little flare of orange that looked obscene against the morning. He told the story again, the small humiliations, the nights of omission, the way he had watched Elena move through the world with a kind of worship that turned to hunger when it met the wolf's indifference. His words were not neat excuses, they were the rubble of someone who had tried to explain his own collapse. He admitted to the meetings and the money transfers and the arrangements that had made the night possible. He did not try to justify the bullet. He said, simply, that he had intended to break the wolf, not to tear someone he loved into shreds. There are admissions that make no redemption, and this was one of them, raw truth offered up like a bone. The wolf had the gun in his hand and the whole city's history in his eyes. I have watched men in his place choose in a breath, gunshots that carve a finality into a life, decisions that make order out of chaos. The old wolf would have lowered his head and fired twice in the dark to solve a problem with a clean ledger entry. The wolf who sat on the hospital stool night after night with his fingers pressed into the pulse of a woman who might leave him had learned a new grammar. He listened to Mateo's confession and found his hands empty of old certainties. The weapon in his fist felt suddenly like a weighing scale with the balance tipped by memory. Mateo's voice cracked as he detailed how jealousy had made him cruel, how he'd watched Elena's face as she smiled at small mercies, how he'd watched the wolf take those smiles for granted, how his love had become a logic that accepted harm as a route to attention. It was the most human way to explain something monstrous, a love that calcified into ownership. Mateo's sentences were a mosaic of apology and rationalization, each tile more bitter than the last. "I thought if I put you in a place where you would need me," he said, voice a low rasp, "if I made you taste what it was to lose, you'd see me. I was wrong. There are moments when the world compresses into the shape of a single decision." He thought of Elena's hands, the shape of her laugh, the way she had told him once, calm, defiant, that saving people did not make them indebted to you. He thought of the long nights spent reading monitors and pleading with doctors, the antiseptic rhythm that counts breaths as if they were beads on a rosary. He thought of the men who wanted blood, who would, if given the signal, tear the city open to make sure no one dared. He thought of the ledger, always the ledger, and of the empty room in his mansion where silence had always arrived on his terms, until now. The wolf spoke once. His voice was not the roar of the wolf but the low rumble of an engine that had been idling too long. "Mateo," he said, and the name carried in the cold like a bell. "You were once my knife and my shield." The words were a map of their history, a catalogue of action and mutual survival. He could have finished by saying that such words do not exist when a man becomes a traitor. Instead he asked something that was simpler and harder: why her? It was not a demand for logic so much as a final attempt to find the reason the world had turned in his hand. Mateo's admission came like a confession in a church after a long wilderness. He spoke of a loneliness that had grown in the shadow of the wolf's empire, of how love had been a small, private thing until it became an ache, and how ache curdled into planning. He spoke of not wanting her dead but wanting to hurt the wolf in a way the ledger would not record. He did not beg for his life in the way that men who expect mercy do. Instead he offered a line of explanation that was almost tender in its shame. "I wanted you to feel the nothing I had felt," he said. "I wanted you to know the ache I carried each night when you slept. I was jealous. His voice broke, I was small. The wolf had always been taught that smallness is contemptible. You survive by taking up space, by making your will felt. But here, in the hush of the pier, the wolf realized that smallness is also a wound. You can be small and be tortured by the sight of someone who has what you want." He felt the old urge rise, the rhythm of a man who rules by setting examples. Kill the traitor, he thought, and the city will sleep a while. He imagined the signatures of fear returning to their posts, the men in his employ swallowing satisfaction like a dry meal. He imagined Elena waking to a kingdom restored and wondered, with a pain that almost undid him, whether she would ever accept a man who had answered her injury by returning to the throne and adding another body to his tally. He did not fire. Instead he moved the gun like a metronome, a slow ticking of possibility. Some say mercy is weakness, others say it takes more courage to put down a weapon than to pull its trigger. He felt both possibilities for the same moment, as if the world asked him to choose between the coherence of being feared and the chaotic, gnawing call of being loved. He thought of the ledger again, not as numbers and territories but as the record of a life, and wondered if killing Mateo would erase the betrayal or only add another layer of violence to a life already saturated with it. He imagined the face of a man who had once been his brother going limp under the weight of his bullet and felt something worse than triumph, an emptiness like falling off the edge of an empire. The wolf lowered the gun. The motion was not theatrical, it was a simple unmaking of an old decision. Mateo's eyes widened not with hope but with a pained, exhausted disbelief. "You will regret this," Mateo whispered, and there was no bravado in it, only a prophecy of consequences. The wolf did not answer. He had learned, painfully, that actions breed consequences he cannot always account for. Choosing mercy was not a clean erasure, it carried with it a calculus he could not foretell. But in that thinned air, made thinner by choice, he put the gun down. Fate is an unkind clerk. It does not care for righteousness nor for new moral experiments. The world does not yield to mercy with politeness. As the wolf took a step back, having made the irrevocable decision to spare the life of the man who had betrayed him, a crack of sound tore the morning like a seam. A single rifle report, thin, precise, punctured the air. The sound was not aimed at him, it spelled a different design. Mateo's shoulder jerked as if pulled by strings, and then he slumped, blood blooming like a dark flower across his chest. He had not yet fallen to the ground before the wolf's mind made the cold arithmetic: a rival sniper, a kill shot aimed to stop whatever mercy might have looked like in a world that profits from chaos. The traitor who had caused this avalanche of suffering had been cut down not by the hand that had the greatest claim, but by a hand that wanted the music of violence to continue without interruption. Mateo's mouth formed a line, no speech left, and then his eyes found the wolf one last time. No words came, perhaps there were none left. The wolf knelt, not because he wanted to collect a dying man in his arms but because his body obeyed the reflexes of a life spent learning to save. He took Mateo's hand, it was warm and shook, and he felt the pulse fade like a boat drifting away from harbor. The sniper's figure was already a rumor on the pier, vanishing among crates and ropes. Someone had wanted this to end with spectacle. The ending the city delivered was quieter and more brutal, a life extinguished by someone else's calculus. The men who had come to watch this ritual, the wolf's lieutenants, the low-level agents of revenge, arrived as if the scene had been choreographed for them. They expected orders to be given and taken, to be told how to respond. The wolf looked at them and saw their faces register 100 demands: action, spectacle, a pressure for him to restore the ledger by turning the hand that had lowered a gun into an engine of fury. But the thing had already been decided in a different currency. Mateo was dead. The point of his mercy had dissolved into the sea, the hole it left could be filled with silence or with more violence. The wolf felt the old grammar of command reach for his throat, like claws slipping into habit. He felt the men around him looking for blood and the city outside expecting an answer. In that moment, something inside him unclenched. He put the gun away. No one saw him do it at first, because men were busy with motions that kept them safe, and he stood. There was a small, private victory in not adding to the body count. He had chosen mercy and fate had responded with cruelty. He realized then a truth that had been forming like a bruise under his skin: no matter the power you wield, you cannot stop the randomness of death. You cannot control who pulls a trigger, or when a life will be turned to quiet. All you can own is the shape of your own hands after the shooting ends. He walked away from the pier as the first real light began to draw the city into view. Men who had expected commands followed like shadows, but he didn't give them mile markers to march by. He left orders muted and wide, to protect what could be protected, to fortify what could be fortified, but he did not give the signal for vengeance. There was a cost: his men would grumble, rivals would attempt to press, and the city would smell weakness and try to gnaw at it. But there was also a different cost to keep tally of, the cost of becoming a man who measures worth only in the currency of fear. He realized that power had always been a poor substitute for meaning. You can build walls and burn books and mark borders with bodies, but those things do not teach you forgiveness or the courage to stand down. In the hospital later, he sat in the chair with the vinyl cracked and watched the machines make small music. Elena's hand rested under his, warm and fragile, and he held it with the kind of attentiveness that felt like penance and like grace both. Mateo was gone, his betrayal had been dealt with by a world that refuses to let mercy be simple. The wolf's internal conflict, the ledger of his life, did not vanish because a rival's bullet had done what his hand refused. Instead, a new problem began: he had to live with the consequences of mercy in a world that often rewards the opposite. So he dropped the gun not because the city would respect his decision, but because there was a small lesson he demanded of himself, that when the blood dried, the person who remained in the mirror would have to be someone he could stand with. He walked away from the pier and from the life that had been built like a fortress around him because the fortress had no room for the fragile thing he had found: love, perhaps, or the memory of it, and because the most dangerous choice he had ever made was to refuse to add another name to the list of the dead. The first sound that reached her was not the steady rhythm of her own heartbeat, it was the slow, faithful beep of the monitor beside her. That small electronic pulse was the bridge between the darkness she had drifted through and the light that now pressed against her eyelids. The world smelled of antiseptic and rain, two things that, together, felt oddly like resurrection. Her fingers twitched against the coarse fabric of the hospital sheets, testing the body that had once betrayed her. The first breath she took was sharp, foreign, and heavy with the scent of survival. She opened her eyes to a room washed in pale gold. The morning sun had crept through the blinds, slicing her world into stripes of light and shadow. For a long moment, she couldn't remember where she was, or why the air felt so heavy. Then, slowly, memory began to drip back in fragments, the sound of gunfire, the pressure of strong arms lifting her, the warmth of a voice breaking against her name. And then, darkness. Her throat was dry when she tried to speak his name, the one word her body still remembered how to form, Luca. It came out broken, barely a breath, but the walls seemed to recognize it. There was no answer, only the whisper of the curtains swaying with the breeze. She turned her head. Beside her bed, where a vase of wilting lilies had surrendered to time, lay a folded letter. The paper was rough, the handwriting steady, deliberate, and unmistakably his. It was the only thing in the room that looked touched by real life. Her fingers trembled as she opened it, the sound of the crease echoing louder than the monitors. You made me human. Don't waste your tears on a man who finally learned how to cry. That was all it said. Nothing more. No explanations. No promises of return. Just those two lines, final, quiet, and absolute. She read them again and again until the ink blurred through the water in her eyes. She had imagined many endings for them, but not this one. Not silence wrapped in paper. Not absence disguised as closure. For days, the doctors came and went, speaking in hushed tones, congratulating themselves on her recovery. But to her, survival felt like punishment and privilege intertwined. They told her she had been lucky that the bullet had missed her heart by an inch, lucky that someone had brought her in on time, lucky that her body had chosen to fight. But luck was a poor word for the way she felt. She wasn't sure she had been spared, only borrowed. There was no sign of him. His men, those who once filled the hospital corridors like silent sentinels, had vanished too. The newspapers whispered about him, the wolf who had walked away from his empire, the ghost who had turned his back on blood and power. Some said he'd fled the city. Others said he'd been killed. But the truth was simpler, quieter, and more painful than any of those myths. He was gone because staying would have meant breaking what little part of her heart had survived him. In the quiet of her room, she could almost hear his voice, low, deliberate, the kind of sound that didn't just speak, but stayed. She remembered his last words before the world had gone black, "Don't leave me." Now it was he who had left, and she was the one reaching into the emptiness. The city went on without him. It always does. The wolf's name faded from alleyway whispers and nightclub corners, replaced by new kings, new wars, new ghosts. But those who had known him, the ones who had served him, feared him, and followed him, felt the tremor his absence left behind. They said he'd gone soft. That love had stripped him of his teeth. They didn't understand that mercy was the hardest kind of cruelty. No one ever saw the letter he left behind. Only she knew its weight. And only she understood the truth behind those words, that the man the city had called a monster had, in the end, become something infinitely more fragile. Sometimes, late at night, she would wake to the sound of rain tapping against the windowpane, and she'd imagine him out there somewhere, beneath the same sky, walking through streets that no longer belonged to him. She liked to think he'd found peace, though part of her doubted that kind of man ever could. How does one live without the armor that had defined them? How does a man who has ruled through fear learn to live without being feared? She'd picture him at the docks where it had all ended, the same gray light, the same endless sea. Perhaps he stood there every morning, watching the horizon, searching for something that couldn't be named. Maybe he still carried that bullet in his pocket, the one that had been meant for him but found her instead. Maybe he looked at it the way other men look at crucifixes, reminders of faith and failure all at once. But the truth, she suspected, was simpler and sadder. He had always been running, from his past, from his own reflection, from the ghosts that wore his voice. And now he had simply found a quieter place to keep running. One morning, weeks after she had been discharged, she returned to the mansion. It had been stripped bare. The gates were unlocked, the rooms hollow. Dust lay thick over the marble floors, muting their once impeccable shine. The air smelled of emptiness and faint cologne, the ghost of him lingering like a shadow that refused to fade. She walked through it slowly, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The walls that had once held his power now felt like a mausoleum for everything they'd lost. She found herself in his study, the one room that had always felt like him, immaculate, calculated, cold. On the desk, beside a single candle burned down to its wick, lay the bullet. The same one that had nearly killed her. Time had rusted its edges, and the faint stain of her blood still darkened the metal. But beside it, small, almost invisible, was something that didn't belong there. A tear mark, dried into the desk's surface. It hadn't fallen from her. It was his. For a long time, she stood there, staring at it. That single tear held the kind of truth no letter could carry. The wolf had cried. Not for power, not for failure, but for love. And in that tear, she saw everything he had never been able to say. He had spent a lifetime mastering control, learning how to bend people and fate to his will. But death and love had taught him the same lesson, that control is an illusion, and some things can only be survived, not conquered. She touched the bullet once, lightly, as if touching a wound. Then she left it there, exactly as it was, a monument to a man who had lived like thunder and vanished like mist. The days that followed were quieter. She returned to her clinic, patching up wounds, setting bones, stitching the broken pieces of strangers back together. But sometimes, when she looked into the faces of the men she treated, men hardened by the same streets that had built him, she saw flashes of his eyes, that flicker of fury wrapped around tenderness. And in those moments, her hands would hesitate, her heart caught between memory and mercy. Rumors drifted in now and then, stories of a man who appeared in small towns, offering protection to those who couldn't afford it. Some said he lived by the sea. Others swore they saw him in the mountains, far from anything resembling civilization. Each story contradicted the last, but she never chased any of them. Some ghosts are meant to stay unfound. At night, she would sit by the window, tracing the edges of the letter with her thumb. She had memorized every line, every slant of his handwriting. The ink had faded a little, but the meaning only grew heavier with time. You made me human. Don't waste your tears on a man who finally learned how to cry. She wondered if he had written those words before the docks or after. If he had known, as he folded the letter, that mercy would fail him, that fate would always take what love leaves behind. She wondered if he'd ever meant for her to find peace, or if he had simply wanted to vanish before she could forgive him. Sometimes, forgiveness is a kind of love. Other times, it's the final cruelty. Seasons turned. The city moved on, forgetting him as cities do. But for her, time was not linear. It folded in on itself, every rainstorm, every dawn, every shadow at her window pulling her back to that night. She stopped trying to erase him. Instead, she learned to live with the echo. She never married. Love, for her, had already lived and died. But she carried him with her, not as a wound, but as a quiet lesson. That even monsters can learn to weep. That redemption isn't about undoing the past, but about learning to walk away from it before it consumes you. Some nights, When sleep refused to come, she would whisper to the dark as though he could still hear her, "You were wrong, Luca. Tears don't make us weak. They make us real." And though the night never answered, she swore she could feel something shift in the air, like the faintest exhale of relief, carried by the wind. Years later, when her hair had grayed and her hands had grown slower, she returned once more to the docks. The city had changed, glass towers now loomed where rust and ruin once stood, but the sea was the same. Its breath, eternal and unforgiving, rolled in steady waves. She knelt at the edge of the pier and let the cold water kiss her fingers. "I kept my promise," she murmured, voice trembling. "I didn't waste my tears." Something glittered in the sand near her hand. She reached for it. It was a bullet, rusted, ancient, and weather-worn. Not his. But in the shape of it, she saw every echo of what they'd been. She smiled, a fragile, tired smile, and let it fall back into the water. The sea swallowed it without sound. They say every story leaves something behind, an unfinished sentence, a word caught in the throat. His story ended in silence, but it lived on in the spaces between breaths. Somewhere, out there beyond the city lights, the wolf had shed his name. He was no longer the ruler of anything, no longer a weapon dressed as a man. He was just Luca now. A man who had once been feared, once been loved, and once, against all odds, had learned to cry. Lingering questions. Can redemption ever undo the damage done by a lifetime of violence? And can love survive the silence that follows? Perhaps not. Perhaps redemption isn't about erasing sins, it's about learning to carry them without letting them drown you. Perhaps love doesn't survive silence, it becomes it. And as the sun climbed over the water, its light catching the ripples in molten gold, the world held its breath for a moment that belonged to both of them. The camera fades on a single image. A bullet, rusted with time, still stained faintly with her blood. And beside it, a single tear mark, dried into the metal. A story of power. A story of love. A story of what remains when both are gone. If this story reached into something quiet inside you, if you've ever believed that even the strongest hearts can shatter, share this story. Tell us what you felt in the comments below. And if you crave more stories where love meets loss, where power unravels into pain, and where every heartbeat tells a truth too heavy to speak, subscribe to CineVerse. Because every story breathes. And sometimes, it bleeds.